for the next 20 minutes or so, you're going to be in 1969, and Margaret, also known as Miggs Durrance, has recently returned from Russia, where she was traveling with the newly formed group, the American Women for International Understanding. And now she is here with us on the grounds of the Aspen Historical Society, which in 1969 would be accurate because the Historical Society did acquire this property in 1969. And so she's here to speak with you informally about her life, her skiing, the origins of her career as a photographer, and the inspiration of these mountains. So please welcome Miss Miggs Durrance.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for this opportunity. And thank all of you for having an interest in local history. And I have a complex one to tell you. It isn't really until I sit down and had to list everything for this presentation that I could get a sense of where I've been, where Dick and I have been, and how we got here. Currently, we're not living in Aspen. However, I think around this wonderful question of the inspiration of the mountains, if I had to name one thing that it has inspired me and sent me forward with doors opening, I would say it was the discovery of skiing as a sport. I also don't know that I set out to have a career as a photographer. Or even that the career I have now would be defined conventionally as a career in photography. But my camera has taken me to exotic places around the world, and I have had the tremendous opportunity to publish photos in the likes of Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Sports Illustrated, National Geographic. So I've reached a wonderful sense of contribution through photography. Now, my college education was in art, and the camera became the form in which I composed, in which I looked at the world and could express myself creatively. Interestingly, I did just return from this remarkable trip to Russia, and in a way it was sort of a culminating experience. I was asked, amongst other women, all with pretty tremendous expertise in their fields, and this group called American Women for International Understanding was the first group of women allowed into Russia. Now, we were met, interestingly, by Valentina Tereshikova, the Russian cosmonaut and first woman in space. She took us to Leningrad. From there, we were able to travel on our own to Romania, Yugoslavia, up the Dalmatian coast. It was a phenomenal trip of goodwill, and I have hopes that there will be more of these events. But I did mention that skiing and the discovery of the sport of skiing for myself was this inspiring event. And I want to go back to that now. Both Dick and I, curiously, were born at sea level. We weren't born in the mountains. I was born in the Bay Area in 1917. And in my childhood, I was an adventurous child. I competed as an equestrian. I rode a friend's horse to a national championship as an equestrian, and I also studied the piano. Now, in college, my first year of college, and we could say that it was an unfortunate or perhaps a fortunate event, but I contracted a serious case of strep infection. And I was in the hospital for 6 weeks. And at the end of that, the doctors told my mother that she was to take me out of the Bay Area climate and for my health. And so that was December, and my mother rented a little cottage in Yosemite, and off we went. Well, as soon as we got there, I signed up for ski lessons. It looked like a lot of fun. And then that first week we were there was a tremendous storm that closed the roads from Yosemite to Merced, and we were stuck there. Well, I had ski lessons to take, and as it turned out, for 6 weeks, I was the only one interested in ski lessons. And so I had essentially private lessons for 6 weeks. And with each week, my enthusiasm grew. I was then able to stay for a remainder of 5 months there in Yosemite, continuing to ski and to learn to ski. It was phenomenal. Now by the beginning of the next school year, I did return to school. And then in January, the Yosemite Ski School called me and asked me if I would like to go to Sun Valley and compete in the Jeffers Cup. Well, I was thrilled to do this, which I did do, and I trained well, I did well, and it wasn't long before I was invited to go again. Now, since my interest in skiing began, I started to read everything I could about skiing magazines, and I kept reading, especially when I read about Sun Valley, I kept reading about this man, Dick Durrance, who was making phenomenal contributions to the sport of skiing and also the publicity of skiing. And I, frankly, wanted to meet him. So when I was invited to return to Sun Valley, which I was, I had in my mind that perhaps I would meet this man, Dick. Well, I didn't meet him. I did not meet him. He wasn't there that year. But I went on skiing, and at this point, I was really learning to ski steeper slopes, faster competition. I raced, and I placed well. And then at that point, I was invited to come train with the 1936 women's Olympic team, who was, they were hopeful for the 1940 Olympics, upcoming Olympics. And this meant a greater commitment, of course, and my mother approved of this, and so I was amongst these women training for the Olympics, and this was thrilling. So I continued to stay in Sun Valley, and it was then that one day out on the slopes, I looked up and there was a man in a tree with the largest camera I had ever seen in my life, and it was Dick Durrance, much more interested at that moment in photography than training. So we did meet, and I began to come to know him. We had shared interests, we found. It turned out that Averil Harriman was very strongly promoting both him as a skier as well as his interest in photography. And Averil Harriman was also supporting much of the women's team. Now it's important, I think, to know this, that at that time there were maybe only 30 women in all of the United States who were actually competitive skiers. It just hadn't become a sport. And there's a woman, Alice Chair, who really was responsible for American ladies becoming competitive international skiers. So we were right at the front of something that as we came to know, would completely take off. Now, at that time, well, the time when I met Dick, many of us were also training for the Harriman Cup race in Sun Valley. And then after that race, quite a few of us went to Mount Hood. Well, everyone who was interested in the Olympic trials went to Mount Hood in Oregon for those tryouts. And Dick and I were both on that trip, and Dick earned a berth on the team, the Olympic team, and I was given a position as an alternate on the team. It was really thrilling. It was thrilling. Now, we were, of course, all anticipating this Olympic event, and then, as some of you may remember, Russia invaded Finland, and the Olympics were canceled. That was the end of that. Well, in spite of our great disappointment, a number of us then went from Mount Hood to Mount Rainier and raced in another race. And I placed second in the silver skis race. I did very well. Now at that time, Dick returned to Dartmouth to finish his education. But in that time that we spent together, we found that our friendship was growing. We shared certainly this love of skiing, and Dick was very forthcoming with helping me with the camera, and I found that it was inspiring to me. So we shared that. He shared his knowledge freely of the skills that he was learning, and we spent a little bit of time in the darkroom too, I will say. But in order to fully appreciate this, I think I need to tell you the story as I know it of how Dick came to love skiing, because it's a delightful story. Dick, as I said, was born in Florida in 1914. His mother was an educator, a beautiful, vivacious, adventurous woman. Her name was America Fair Pillins. And she, one day, she had 5 children, so Dick obviously had 4 siblings. He was the second oldest. And one day she simply took them all out of school and said, we're going to Germany. And the reason she gave was that there was a better school system in Germany. That was partly true. The bigger truth was that there was some domestic strife. And she packed up the children and off they went to Germany. Now, it was a close family. They didn't really have a plan of where they would end up. So together, they imagined what they were looking for, what would be exciting and interesting, and they poured through brochures and pictures, and they kind of spotted this place that they might head towards. It was Garmisch in the Bavarian Alps. And they made their way by train and eventually arrived in Garmisch on a day, as the story goes, when there was a foot of fresh snow, a beautiful blue sky. They were surrounded by 10,000-foot peaks. And the kids' priority was to put skis on their feet, climb up as far as they could, and then fly down the mountain. Now, bear in mind that none of them spoke German. And so their mother wasn't necessarily roping them in and hauling them off to school. But eventually they did get to school, they did learn German, and they did take ski lessons. And by 1933, they were there 5 or 6 years, Dick had established himself as one of the top European racers. This was a phenomenal thing, although if you were to ask him, he would say, well, there weren't that many of them in Europe. But it was still quite an accomplishment. And he was 18 or 19 then, and the prospect of returning to Florida at the sea, where there were no mountains, had to have been really uncomfortable. So in his way, in the family way, and the family way was, if there was something you really wanted, you could figure out how to get it. And so he had befriended someone who told him about Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College had just organized one of the first college ski teams in the country. And he was determined to be accepted at Dartmouth, which he was, on the condition that he had one remedial year of school, mostly to polish his grammar. He had, his English was spoken with kind of a German structure. So he did indeed have his remedial year, was accepted at Dartmouth and thrived, of course, as a skier. But I think surprisingly to him, he discovered that he also had this phenomenal education. And he was an art student too, with a passion and an interest in photography and film, an art form that was developing. So he skied for Dartmouth, and as a brilliant skier. But perhaps you can see how these two people from opposite American coasts were somehow, through this sense of adventure and bravery, I'm sure on some level, and this willingness to just jump in and do things. And I would say that I have lived my life mostly by nothing ventured, nothing gained. So, and that probably started in my childhood with that first horse championship, or maybe even before. But here were these two people drawn perhaps to the magnificence of the Rocky Mountains and skiing. Well, Dick proposed to me. That was about 1939, and it was in the winter. We knew we had I had some wedding plans to make, but then one of our friends, Friedel Pfeiffer, had a wedding, and which many of us gathered together and we went to this wonderful celebratory wedding, which we followed with a trip to Alta. Now, neither Dick nor I had been to Alta before, but we were astounded at its beauty. And it was so simple. It had a lodge that was unfinished. It only had one ski run. But we looked at this, how tremendous a place this would be to ski or to vacation in the wintertime. And it stuck in our mind, and we didn't really let go of that. Well, we went back to Sun Valley. Dick returned to work, and actually a film that he was making called Sun Valley Ski Chase. And I returned to Berkeley to plan our June wedding. So we're married in June. We returned to Sun Valley and our jobs. I had a job taking tickets at the Opera House, and Dick was working in photo publicity. But sometime during that summer, that image of Alta didn't leave either of us, and Dick made some inquiries. He wanted to know if there was any interest in developing Alta, finishing that lodge, maybe developing some more ski runs. And yes, there was interest. So he contacted a man that he had known who was both a patron and had been a teammate. His name was Jay Laughlin. Now, it's probably interesting to note that at that moment when Dick called him to tell him about this idea, Dick happened to be involved in a very complex literary venture that would come to publish the works of the highest names in modernist literature, world literature. A huge project. However, Jay was intrigued with this idea of Alta, so he intrigued enough to come out and take a look, which is what he did. And he had the same response that Dick and I had, that this place was magnificent. He also liked the idea of partnering with Dick. So he became the funding, and we were the workers. And it wasn't long before that lodge was complete, and the structure anyway, and then I sewed all of the curtains and all of the bedspreads and started knitting my way through sweaters for the ski team. So then we were in Alta, and we were in Alta for 2 years. Dick developed a ski school there. He had never taught before, but he seemed to be a complete natural. He loved the sport. He did the sport exceptionally well. And he was actually very interested in it being a joyous, fun, less formal experience for people. He was a good teacher. I was working in the ski shop. I did manage to break my leg both Januaries that we were there. So with all of that, we were quite busy. And then I discovered that I was pregnant. Well, Alta is a avalanche-prone mountain. And we looked at each other and realized it probably wouldn't be a good idea to be there when our first child arrived. So, but before we actually made that move, several things, other bigger things were happening. In 1941, it looked very much like America would get pulled into World War II. And Dick was called and asked if he would train paratroopers for ski warfare, which he readily agreed to do. So in those last months that we were there, Dick was involved with that. but we still knew that we needed to find a place to live that I could get to a hospital and we would have the kind of care and home life that we needed for our family that was just about to get larger. Now, another phone call from another person man that Dick had worked for. Actually, he had partnered with Dick training paratroopers, but he had then moved to Seattle to work for Boeing, and he called Dick and he said, there's an opening. Would you be interested in it? And the timing was perfect, and so off we went to Seattle, where Dick thrived in that environment as well. It took like a duck to water. Before long, he was sent to University of Washington to take engineering, some basic engineering courses. He also was asked to do training films. And with the budget that the military had, he expanded his skill set with filmmaking. So at the end of 3 years in Seattle, Dick had new tools to work with. But by that time, we'd been in the rain for 3 years. There was gas rationing, so we didn't really get to the mountain to ski. And we were missing it. We were longing for the sun. We were longing for the mountains. So off we went to Denver, where Dick was involved with ski sales, development of ski equipment, selling chairlifts. And while that was going on, there was this little town west, Aspen, and it seemed to be going through a renaissance. And this fellow, Walter Pepka, an industrialist from Chicago, was buying up property, and he and his brother-in-law, Paul Nitze, were developing this ski resort. Well, this was pretty interesting to us, and we actually went out for the opening of the ski resort, and that was a tremendous party. So a year later, Dick was asked if he would come and manage the ski company. We did have a reservation. I had a fairly strong reservation, I suppose, based on that party that we had attended. And I actually frankly wondered if a marriage would survive that sort of celebration, especially on a regular basis. But I've come to temper that thought, and the marriage certainly did survive. And Dick did wonderful things for the ski company. First of all, he brought the 1950 FIS championship races, international races, which brought people from the world, put Aspen on the map as a ski destination. And along with that came the necessary development of the ski mountain itself, which some of the innovation was wide ski runs. Keep in mind, up to that point, people were mostly walking up mountains and then skiing down whatever terrain they could make their way through, and it was often very unpredictable terrain. So Ruthie's Run was one of them. It was a tremendously wide run, and the impact of that was that not only skiers and racers and ski people who were competing in skiing, but people who just simply were fascinated by the sport were now coming to Aspen. So this was going along wonderfully. Dick also started to film the race, the FIS race in 1950. But in 1952, he really wanted to finish that film. And he was drawn to include some European racers. So, I'm sorry, in 1950, about 1951. So we went back to Europe and settled ourselves with kind of a home base in Garmisch. And during that time, I was able to improve my photographic skills. And also around that time, because of our film connections and who we were working with, one of my friends, my good friends, Rocky Cooper, married to Gary Cooper, invited me to go for a trip to Hawaii. And she handed me a 35mm camera. I had never used a 35mm camera, and she used the movie camera. Well, when I came back, I showed Dick the photos I had taken, and he was impressed. He said, "These are really good." And so that Christmas, he bought me a wonderful camera. I went on to take more pictures. He encouraged me together to use some of these as promotional shots. And before I knew it, I actually had recognition as an accomplished photographer. Now our life from there kind of spiraled into more filmmaking, more photographic work. And in 1952, Dick officially resigned from the ski company, and we developed films, and there were many of them. We filmed at the Olympics. I had a terrific spot as the prime photographer on one of the greatest jumps during that Olympics. Our clients, Pan Am and Warner Brothers, were opening up huge opportunities for us. And many times with these either documentary films or promotional films or adventure films, my stills were used for promotional material. So perhaps I would say that together, Dick and I have been watching and recording history as it happens through these camera lenses while living the family life that I love. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And we strived in all of our ventures, raising the boys, furthering the sport of skiing, competing, resort development, taking pictures and making films that would attract and inspire others. So coming back to this recent trip to Russia with the American Women for International Understanding, I really realized on this trip how my photographs have the capacity to open up worlds for people who haven't yet traveled to these places. It gives the opportunity to see others' lives through the camera. And I'm hopeful that continues to build understanding. And I'm also hopeful that there will be more of these trips in the future. So right now, it's just a joy to be back in the mountains and to look around and see and remember and recall our connection to this inspiration. So I thank you so much for your interest. And if you have questions, I would love to entertain them.
So the way, so if anybody has any questions for Miggs in 1969, please ask.
How many children did you end up having?
I have 2 sons. I believe they're in the audience. 2 wonderful sons who were terrific skiers and artists in their own right.
And they traveled with you?
Oh yes. Not on every trip. There were times when either Dick traveled someplace or I did. And it was important that they spend some of that time in school.
Well, if there are no other questions for Miggs, I'd like to present Ms. Cher Coleman as Miggs Durrance. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions for Cher about Miggs or about her research or the process.
So the book, did that come from the book?
A lot of it did, and then because that book is, and the book that Dick is mentioning is called Man on the Medal by John Jerome. It's I would say if you've had any interest at all, read the book. It's incredible. It's an incredible story, and it packs so much of these lives into a photo book also. So you as well have the benefit of the images that were taken throughout this period of time, and then also there's an audio interview. So it was wonderful to listen to voices, and then there were little bits and pieces that showed up in other pieces of information, but most, that was the richest source for sure.
The name of the book
is Man on the Medal, and it's written by John Jerome, and I did bring it in case anyone wants to just see what it looks like.
We do have a few copies.
Oh, good.
So do
Okay,
we.
well,
So do we.
I'm going to pass it on to people that I know that love the sport, love the area, and would completely be thrilled with this because it's very inspiring.
Any other questions?
Awesome.
Share, thank you. And now you get to come into the present day, no longer 1969, and mysteriously you're going to be meeting one of the first Americans killed in the Battle of Britain. So there's a little bit of a time discrepancy there. I think we'll come to understand that in a minute. I'd like to present Mr. Billy Fiske.
Bravo.
Good afternoon. My name is William Meade Lindsay Fiske III. Yeah, I know. Call me Billy. My friends call me Billy. I was born in 1911 into a wealthy New York banking family, blah, 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 and was afforded all the qualities afforded by a fine income and a fine family, blah, blah, blah. One of my biographers would say of me, wherever he walked, it seemed as if light followed him, as if he'd stepped from the very pages of a Scott Fitzgerald novel. Give me a break. Oh, don't misbelieve me. I'm fine with being born into wealth. It afforded us many privileges. I saw many things over the course of my life, especially as a boy, which most boys would not see. You might say I was born in the fast lane and lived most of my life in the fast lane. I loved speed. It would become the driving force of my life, to go as fast as possible all the time. It might be in a way that killed me in the end. That and loyalty to my wife's homeland, merry old England. Did I fail to mention that I'm dead? As a doornail? Most certainly. As the Munchkins put it so succinctly, I'm morally, ethically, spiritually, actually, positively, absolutely, undeniably, and reliably dead, really dead, sincerely dead, ding dong, the Fiske is dead, which old Fiske, the Billy Fiske. I could tell you why I'm able to speak to you from beyond the mysterious curtain, but if I did, I'd have to kill you. Just kidding, I can't explain it. I just happen to be here on this day with the ability to see everything that's happened since I passed away at the tender age of 29 in 1940, and I feel privileged to be here to tell you my story today. For whatever reason, it has been said that I died in a hurricane. Did you hear? No, this is true. I was overhearing once a cocktail party where it was described that I had died in the war, and a woman spoke up and said, oh, no, Billy Fiske died in a hurricane. And she's right, to some degree. Not a tropical hurricane. I was killed in a Hawker hurricane, one of the stalwart British fighters involved in the Battle of Britain. Not quite as romantic or receiving as much press as the supramarine Spitfire of such great renown, but the hurricane did much of the brunt of the battle, facing the fury of the German Luftwaffe, and actually shot down twice as many of the German planes as did the Spitfire. For whatever reason, I'm here now. I'm expired, if not expunged. As I said, I grew up in wealth and privilege and spent considerable time in Europe in my youth. My family's family moved to Paris in 1924. My father worked for the prestigious investment banking company of Dillon, Reed and Company. And because of our wealth, we were able to spend much time at the poshest of resorts, including the spa at St. Moritz, where I eventually attended boarding school. It was in St. Moritz that my love for speed came to full fruition for the first time. St. Moritz was the home of the Cresta Run, one of the world's first true, authentic bobsleigh runs, in all its icy, sneaky, curvy splendor. And at age 16, I was already a veteran. In fact, taking a run down the Cresta Run has been called the greatest laxative known to man. My natural skill brought me great early renown, and this affinity with speed and risk made me a logical, if rather youthful choice, to pilot one of the sleds in the Winter Olympics held in St. Moritz in 1928. 16-year-old me planned on competing in these games, but I needed a team, and I was assigned a sled, which became known as USA-2. Now, my second in command was a man named Clifford Gray, G-R-A-Y, a failed entertainer, a songwriter, a singer, and a playboy, at least in his own mind. And this would lead to one of the great puzzles in sports of the 20th century. He would become intertwined with another Clifford Gray, J-R-E-Y, a Brit who happened to be a songwriter and an actor of some renown. And for whatever reason, the two became intertwined in history to the fact that their children didn't know which was which, or seemed to. And Clifford Gray, G-R-E-Y, is buried with a plaque over his grave expounding upon his great Olympic success, which is totally false. The true Clifford Gray, G-R-A-Y, my teammate, passed away in relative obscurity in Oregon, which I guess is redundant, much later than this. Now, the bobsleigh in 1928 was being run as a 5-man event for the first time in history. So, with myself and Gray, G-R-A-Y, 3 other teammates needed to be found. So, the U.S. Olympic Commission logically put an ad into the Paris edition of the Herald Tribune. 3 respondees, none of whom had ever been in a bobsled, much less seen a bobsleigh before, by the name of Nyan Tucker, Jeffrey Mason, and Richard Park. They responded and were hired. They joined me and Clifford Gray, who was then 36. I was the baby at 16. And Nyan Tucker at 42 was the senior citizen of the group. Not surprising that after the Olympics, he never sat in a bobsleigh ever again. Now, in St. Moritz, the conditions for the bobsleigh were abominable, and the event had to be shortened from 5 runs to 2 runs. The temperature rose by almost 40 degrees during the day of the competition, and the surface of the course began to melt and become sloppy. Now, bearing in mind that bobsleighs were almost completely open at this time, and with the 5-man bobsleigh, we lay down stacked like sardines, one on top of another, all 5 of us, me at the front steering, and the men in the back would bob up and down awkwardly and rather unceremoniously as we went down to increase the speed of the sleigh. Now, in most cases, most teams from most countries, just the back man would bob. In our case, we used 2 men in the straights, and then on the corners, Park would bob all the way down. It was reckless, but effective. Now, the event, as I said, turned down to just 2 runs due to poor conditions, and our sled won, beating the second American sled driven by Jennison Heaton, age 23, by a half second. Despite of, or maybe because of, the conditions, I showed my typical daredevil instincts. According to the papers, I showed exceptional courage to steer my underdog and outclassed men to victory. I became the youngest man to win a Winter Olympic gold until 1992, when a Finn, a ski jumper, younger by 1 day, took over the honor from me. After the Olympics, I moved to England and then came to Cambridge. Studying at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, I came close to gaining a golfing blue. I was quite the sportsman. And I held the unofficial Cambridge-London road record in my custom, supercharged, 4.5-liter open-wheeled British racing green Bentley. I studied history and economics and raced my car around the country lanes. My obsession with speed found an outlet. I would drive my fellow golfers the 24 miles to Middenhall in Suffolk in 17 minutes, occasionally exceeding speeds of 110 miles per hour on these winding country lanes. Imagine the occasional bicyclist we encountered on the way. The quest for speed would follow me throughout my life. I was known as the King of the Cresta, winning titles 1935 through 1938. I loved fast cars and sleds, and eventually skis, and women, and airplanes. But the airplanes would come later, and we need one more Olympics before I tell that story. Now, at the opening ceremonies of the 1932 Games, held in Lake Placid, New York, I was honored to carry the U.S. flag at the head of the U.S. contingent. We were, after all, on our home turf. Now, since Olympian champion shot putter Ralph Waldo Rose had refused to dip the Stars and Stripes to King Edward at the 1908 Olympics in London, it had become an American tradition for the national flag to never be lowered. Oops. As I went by then Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I dipped the flag. In 1942, Congress made Rose's tradition law, and I remain the only man to have made the mistake. Now, in Lake Placid, the bobsleigh returned to its four-man format, and now we would sit one behind the other, as you are aware is the tradition today. Clifford Gray stayed with the team, G-R-A-Y, and this time we were joined by two new teammates. Selection trials had to be canceled because of the poor conditions, so the men were hired on their reputations and past performances. Jay O'Brien, once again acting as the manager of the team, selected himself. James O'Brien was a man with three passions. Chief among these was riding horses, then came chasing money, and then came chasing women. It was a cute design for life. He was a champion at all three. He rode horses, which settled the second quest, which led to good success in the third. Jay married well many times, eventually marrying the ex-wife of one of the richest men in America. The fourth man was Eddie Egan, a Harvard and Oxford and Yale trained lawyer who had won a boxing gold in the light heavyweight division at the Antwerp Olympics in 1920. Eddie Egan, born into a poor Irish-American family in Denver, Colorado, had gone on to become the U.S. amateur heavyweight boxing champion as well as the UK, and had fought Dempsey in 1920. 2 years later, he won the Olympic boxing title at the Summer Games. Our bobsleigh in success in 1932 would make him the first man, and to this day, the only man, to have a medal from the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. He took to the sled as he did to all sports, as if he was born to it. Now, as the previous games in 1928, the weather was atrocious. The bobsleigh was plagued first by blizzard conditions we were unable to train in, and then by an unseasonable warm spell. In fact, the competition for the bobsleigh wasn't held until the games were officially over. But this made us the focus of attention. 14,000 people turned up on the day of competition and lined the sides of Mount von Hovenberg, more than twice the number that it could comfortably accommodate, and there was a 7-mile gridlock traffic jam. Now, the final of the four-man bobsled had already been postponed 3 times because of the warm weather. There wasn't enough ice on the course to chill a cocktail. There had been spectacular crashes, serious injuries, and teams eliminated in practice and the other heats. The event was supposed to be the centerpiece of the entire Olympics. And the Lake Placid track had opened just the previous year and was the centerpiece. It is the reason that Lake Placid was selected to be the host of these Olympics over Chicago. And it cost $200,000 to build, an unheard of sum during what we've come to know as the Great Depression. Now, Hank Homburger knew this better than anyone. He had designed and built the track and was the head driver for the local Saranac Lake Red Devils. They, earlier in the year, had set a world record on the 1.5-mile course of 1 minute and 52 seconds. Saranac Lake was just a short way up the road, and they, of course, were the local heroes. Heck, the local florist was the brakeman of the sled. The Olympics was theirs to lose. Let's jump right into my sleigh during the course of the finals run. February, Sunday, 1932, we're frozen on the rim of the track. The white-face turned merely an inch away from oblivion, my team leaning desperately into the track. Egan would later say, if any other man other than Fiske had been captain, we would have been over the edge. Billy saved us. We were on the edge of the banking and disaster. I pulled hard, the sled surged back towards the center of the track, the 4 of us fighting the forces of gravity and momentum. We shot out of the curve and flew down the straight, catching our breath as the frost misted our eyes. We passed through the shady turn that finished Fitzgrau and the German team, and ran into the notorious zigzag curve at the end of the track. My head snapped backward, and then forward, and then zigged as we zagged on the course. We leapt off a jump, all 4 runners off the ground. As it landed, we whipped to the right. My head snapped left, right, and back again. I thought I broke my neck. And suddenly, it was over. When our sled crossed the finish line, the clock read 1 minute, 56 seconds. It was our fastest run of the competition. Hamburger's team would have to break his world record to beat us. The press would say, Hamburger made a spectacular effort, riding the curve sign, taking every chance, but the best he could get out of his sled was 1 minute, 54 seconds. It was quick, but not enough. Gray, Egan, O'Brien, and myself took the gold, my second, and Egan's second, counting his one at the Summer Olympics. As I said, he's the only one to accomplish this feat. Evidently, I drove sensationally. Henry Hamburger, driving USA 2, had closed the gap, but not enough to steal the gold. By the way, O'Brien, who was a week shy of his 49th birthday, made Tucker from our previous Olympics, who at age 42 was a spring chicken compared to O'Brien's 49. And as always, as it seems to be in this case, the 4 of us never sat together in a bobsled again. Now, in between my winters and the Olympics, I was flitting around as my fancy suited. I spent the 3 years studying history and economics at Cambridge, and then dilly-dallied in the movie business, making Hollywood connections. And then I set off on a world tour, including a Gauguin-like idyll in Tahiti, where I co-produced a schlocky romance called White Heat, about a love affair between an interracial slave and a plantation owner. The film tanked, but I found other ways to amuse myself. I took flying lessons, continued to race the Cresta Run, and I set a new record for the nighttime run between Nice and Cannes on my birthday in my green Bentley. I dallied in the highest socials on celebrity circles, playing golf with my pal Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in the Chinese Junior Amateur Championship, and I had to make a hurried departure from Shanghai following a rumored affair with a diplomat's wife. It has also been said that I piloted a Stutz Bearcat in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Now, I won't admit to that or to the rumored affair with the diplomat. Now, during the buildup of the 1936 games at Garmisch-Partenkirchen, I was offered the captaincy of the U.S. team. I turned it down. I kept my reasons private. But my Jewish friend Irving Jaffe, double gold medal winning speed skater from the Lake Placid Olympics, insisted that I did it because I objected to the treatment of the Jews in Germany. The policies of Germany and the regime, and Hitler in particular, did not sit very well with me. Now, that year also, 1936, was a big year in American skiing. The Games in Germany in 1936 introduced alpine skiing events to the world. Averell Harriman, as the CEO and chief owner of the Union Pacific, developed Sun Valley in Idaho as a way to promote the use of his railroad and skiing in America. And also he brought Friedel Pfeiffer, a man who had become involved in Aspen, from Austria to teach the Arlberg technique in Sun Valley. Harriman's scouts had actually considered Aspen as a potential site for the venture, but determined that the infrastructure here was too dilapidated. U.S. Forest Service, pressured to find uses for America's forests and things that might create jobs during the throes of the Depression, latched on to this growing industry of skiing, and 1936 also marked the beginning of Aspen's ski destiny. I was in California on my quest to find a suitable destination. I was looking at the Sierras to create an alpine-style resort in the United States. At the time, I doubted there was anywhere in America that had the right combination of climate, weather, snow, and accessibility. I just happened to meet a man at a cocktail party named Tom Flynn, who grew up in Aspen, where his father operated the Toplift mine in Little Annie Basin. As an adult, Flynn invested in development opportunities inland and in farming in California. He was interested in a new industry, and after initially trying to sell me a mine site, caught on that I was looking for an alpine destination, and began to extol the virtues of Aspen, saying it could rival St. Moritz. We planned a journey to Colorado immediately. I contacted 2 associates who I'd been involved with and interested in my winter sports idea. One was Ted Ryan, the grandson of Thomas Fortune Ryan. I suppose you might call him the William Buffett of the 1920s. And the other was Robert Rowan of the Los Angeles real estate family. Now Flynn, back in Colorado, contacted Fred D. Willoughby, Aspen's mayor, and an old acquaintance to arrange a tour of the Little Annie Basin. Flynn brought with him Thor Groswald, the ski manufacturer, and Frank Ashley, another Denver businessman, who had been writing articles on the possibilities of skiing in Colorado. Now, Mayor Willoughby was interested in not only a chance at a new economy in the Roaring Fork Valley, but as CEO of the Midnight Mine, perhaps had personal interests because they owned most of the property in the Midnight Mine Basin. Now, the party was driven to the basin by Fred and guided by Fred. Groswald applauded the suitability of the ski trails, saying they were suitable and excellent for the purpose. Flynn chose the highest point in the basin to erect a monument. We all signed a paper exclaiming that this was going to be known as Flynn Peak, and proclaiming the beginning of what we enthusiastically espoused as America's next great ski resort. Now, I was an amateur aviator, anything with speed, right? And I flew in a private plane with Rowan and with the Douglas aircraft head engineer Ed Burton. Now, there were no airports in the valley at all. We landed on a golf course in Glenwood Springs. Later on, we would have to appeal to the public power company, and they obligingly lowered the lines on the golf course so we could take off the plane at the end of the trip. During the trip, it was Burton who suggested the site on the Sardi property as the future home of the Aspen Airport. Once I saw the basin, I was immediately convinced of its potential. I should have paid perhaps a bit more attention at the time to the orientation and the slope and the sun, but like anyone else who ever looked out at that basin towards Mount Hayden, I was immediately struck and felt that I had found my St. Moritz in America. I proceeded to involve all of my partners and go to the Forest Service researching tax permits, land grants, and snow records. I returned the next winter, or during the winter, with Groswald and famous ski expert Otter Schnabes, and we toured the basin thoroughly with Willoughby to check on aspects, angles, and terrain details. Now, as soon as the snow fell, Ted Ryan and I visited again. Willoughby hauled us up to the basin using a tractor and a sled so we could check on the snow conditions at the time. No time was wasted. Flynn, myself, Ryan, and Rowan formed the Highland Bavarian Corporation, and plans were made to build a ranch and a lodge at the confluence of Castle Creek and Conundrum Creek. We bought the property. The lodge, which is still there, was designed by the same architect who designed the Santa Anita Jockey Club. It featured 2 bunk rooms for guests, a dining room, bunk rooms, a living room, a large double-sided fireplace, which was faced with stone bought from Albany, merely 12 miles west of Aspen. Dubbed the Highland Bavarian Lodge, we gave it as much of a European feel as we could, and we hired artist Jimmy Bordrero to paint Bavarian figurines along the trim. The lodge opened in time for Christmas guests with a grand party for Aspenites, speeches by the mayor and all the partners, and a symbolic raising of the flag which had our corporate insignia, a Bavarian hat. The goal for 37 was to promote the possibilities of a ski resort in the area. The lodge itself wasn't the end-all. It was a base for us to continue exploring the valley and bringing potential investors to the site. Visitors at the lodge were treated to meals cooked by an Austrian chef named Franz Keller. Charles Grover and Flynn's son Edward, both locals, drove the bus to retrieve visitors from the train depot and to help around with the lodge as needed. Taggart hauled guests from the lodge to the bottom of Little Annie in his horse-drawn sleigh for 50 cents a ride. That meadow was the location of Aspen's first ski races. Now, hardier, more athletic skiers could attach climbing skins to the bottom of their skis and begin to explore the other high mountain valleys and gulches in the area. And if indeed they chose to, they could climb all the way to the top, go over the ridge into Tortolet Park, and ski down old mining roads into Aspen proper. Perhaps the first time since the miners had used that area that skiers had descended that way. I hired a well-known humorist from New Yorker magazine to write a widely distributed brochure about the venture. Benchler and his editor and publisher, Harold Ross of the New Yorker, were both members of the famed Algonquin Round Table, a group of New York City literati which met for lunch almost every day. Ross was actually from Aspen, a house right across the street here. But he kept his Western origin secret from all but his closest friends. You know what? I'm going to read from this brochure. It's droll, it's witty, a supposed picture of Robert Benchley on the front, but you can bet that his rather portly self never saw a pair of skis. This little brochure is intended to portray a little bit about the subject of Aspen, Colorado, both to the minds of those who know something about it already and the minds of those who have been slowly going crazy during the past few weeks through hearing people talk about Aspen without having the slightest idea of what Aspen might be. Aspen, Colorado is a place where you can indulge in winter sports without having to get a passport, wrestle with the Atlantic, shop in Paris at the expense of your health, and come all the way back again. The solving of these money and other nuisances is not Aspen's only virtue to winter resort skiing, but for skating and bobsledding enthusiasts, you can have just as good a time falling down in Aspen as you can in any of the European resorts. And should you choose to stand up, you can get just as much fun as you could in the Alps. A fact which seems to have eluded American sportsmen, which seem to be unaware of the fact that there are hills, mountains, and snow in this country. Robert Benchley. Now, December 1936 was a low snow year, and Little Annie Basin was not particularly impressive. Not feeling confident in our own judgment, we hired a couple of experts from Europe to come assess the site. André Roche, a famous Swiss mountaineer, and Italian snow specialist Dr. Gunther Langs, both of whom arrived in January of 1937. Now, Roche spent more than half a year exploring the valley's potential. I spent what time I could climbing and skiing with him. His eventual recommendations represented a complete departure from what we originally planned. The partners had wanted an American site to equal St. Moritz, and Roche proposed a village where Ashcroft sits, with ski runs to the top of Electric Peak. He said the new location would rival anything in Europe. He carefully evaluated wind conditions, sun exposure, avalanche hazards, and snow depths before recommending his lift and run locales. Most of the runs were on open slopes, which required little tree cutting, which we were much in favor of. He believed the high elevations would offer unparalleled snow conditions and a season that could last into June. Now, meanwhile, in addition to my Colorado venture, I had other things going on in my life. In 1938, I returned to England and I married a countess, the most beautiful girl in the world, Rose Bingham. She had recently divorced the Earl of Warwick, who was famous for his fleeting Hollywood cameos alongside Errol Flynn and David Niven under the stage name Michael Brooke. Now, as I had mentioned, had made many connections in Hollywood, having produced that abominable project in Tahiti, but I returned to banking in my father's firm in New York in 1939. But not for long. It was a brief stay. Hitler happened. I had always been very vocal about my distaste with the Nazi Party and Hitler in particular. In August 1939, it became clear that war was inevitable. I left the USA to enlist in the Royal Air Force. Now, not that the Royal Air Force was taking American citizens at this time. In fact, Americans were greatly discouraged from entering the war at the danger of losing their citizenship. But it didn't deter me. I simply decided to con the recruiting officer into thinking that I was Canadian. I wrote in my diary at the time, "There's really only one reason other than my own amusement, and that is the fact that I believe I can lay claim to being the first U.S. citizen to join the Royal Air Force in England after the outbreak of the war. I don't say this with any particular pride except perhaps insofar as is my conscience." Now, to enlist, I had to con my way through a meeting with the Air Chief Marshal William Elliott. I got up the day before and played a round of golf at Rosehampton to give, as I said to myself, a healthy look. Needless to say, for once I had a quiet Saturday night. I didn't want to show up the next morning with 2 eyes for blood-stained oysters. After training, I was posted to Squadron number 601, which would become known as the Millionaire Squadron, because all the members had been handpicked from the ranks of White's Club in St. James by Lord Edward Grosvenor. The men there had a reputation for playing high-stakes poker. Hundreds of pounds would change hands during the course of a game, and they played polo on motorcycles. I fit right in. Our somewhat cavalier attitude was demonstrated when we were scrambled to protect the ships in the channel and gave ourselves the code name Bosom. Heading for ships under attack, Bosom! Squad leader Archibald Hope misheard the radio and, fearing for the safety of the local pub called The Ship in Bosham, stationed part of our squadron around the locale to prevent any underhanded threat from occurring. Hopefully, Hope's faith in me was not misplaced, and I think it was vindicated by my talent. I truly was a natural when it came to flying fighter planes. Hope would later say of me, "Unquestionably, Billy Fiske was the best pilot I'd ever known. It was unbelievable how good he was. He picked it up so fast it wasn't true. He'd flown a bit before, but he was a natural fighter pilot. He was also terribly nice and extraordinarily modest, and fitted into the squadron very well." Squadron leader Riddle recalled, "The speed with which Fiske qualified through air training school to become an operational pilot was astonishing. The entire squadron was endeared to Billy. He personified the champion of the underdog. His flying reactions were extraordinary. It was thought as though he was part of the plane, and he was usually the fastest to the club in nearby Bosham with its brilliant wine cellar, which we nominated as our squadron headquarters. He was aware and caring, sensitive to those who maybe seemed unhappy. It was typical that he couldn't bear the thought of leaving his friends alone to fight the Luftwaffe." Kind words from friends long gone. I compared the handling of my Hurricane fighter to that of my treasured Bentley as I roared through the small roads in Europe. Now, the Hawker Hurricane, though it was getting a bit long in the tooth at the time, had been introduced in 1935, one of the first of a generation of new fighter planes. It was a monoplane, but it shared some of the construction techniques of the earlier biplanes: wooden spars on control surfaces covered in glued fabric. Older techniques, but which made the plane easy and cheaper to manufacture than an all-metal plane, and they were produced in great numbers. It was agile, relatively fast, the first plane capable of flying 300 miles per hour at sea level, and was easily a match for some of the finest fighters that the Germans could offer at the time, the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs. But the pilot's compartment was not well armored. In essence, we were flying in a bathtub full of gasoline. Now, operating a plane in a three-dimensional flying environment is quite different than anything else most people ever had a chance to do. I had been accustomed to these sort of activities with my bobsleigh training and the runs at Cresta and the fast driving that I had been enamored of my whole life, and I took to it immediately. I flew my first operational sortie on the 27th of July, 1940. Over the next 27 days, I flew 42 operations into the thick of the Battle of Britain. I made 6 claims for enemy kills, including a Henkel bomber, which, according to other people, I had basically herded into a barrage balloon as my guns were out of ammunition. My logbook, October 11th, reads, August 11th. Saw 4 probables, 3 badly damaged, squadron, lost 4. Terrific fight. Terrified but fun. Had to lead squadron in. Willie's engine had failed. Now, I should mention, at the time, as would become customary later on, we had no gun cameras. There were no official records that I had any confirmed kills. I myself felt that I had, over the course of my days in the squadron, shot down 6 fighters. This was never confirmed. My August luck ran out on the 16th. My Hurricane was damaged in a dogfight with a group of Stuka dive bombers over the east coast at Selsey Bill. Instead of bailing out, I nursed my sputtering fighter, flames coming out of the undercarriage, over the coastline, and I glided in, wheels up, and landed on the belly of the plane on the airstrip at Tangmere. The fuel tank exploded as my plane hit the ground, and I was trapped inside as the plane burned. Squadron leader Hope taxied up to the wreck, got out. There were 2 ambulance men already there. They had pulled me from the plane, but were unable to figure out how to release the parachute, and Archie Hope showed them how. I was burned about the hands and ankles and in terrible pain. Tangmere's medical bay had been bombed, so I was given a shot of morphine and taken to the hospital in a nearby town. It seemed to most of my comrades that my wounds weren't that serious and that I would recover. But 2 days later, I died, probably mostly from shock. I was the first U.S. citizen to join the Royal Air Force and the first American airman to be killed in the service of the RAF. A year later, essentially on the 4th of July, 1941, a plaque was unveiled in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. The inscription reads, "An American citizen who died that England might live." Now, the decision to commemorate me on American Independence Day was undoubtedly politically driven. America wasn't in the war yet. Winston Churchill, who himself was half American, was very anxious to capitalize on my popularity. And he saw, obviously, the value in lauding an American victim of the war, in provoking America into the war. Archibald Sinclair, the Secretary of State for Air, unveiled the plaque with a simple dedication. Here was a young man for whom life held much. Under no kind of compulsion, he came to fight for Britain. He came, he fought, he died. My grave lies beside a Sussex cornfield in a secluded corner of the Boxgrove Priory near the airfield at Tangmere. There I have a full stained glass window showing it draped stars and stripes. The inscription on my headstone simply reads, "He died for England." Now, back in Colorado, when America entered the war, obviously all efforts at the skiing industry ceased. Ted Ryan, who sustained a serious skiing injury, offered Ashcroft as a training ground for the 10th Mountain Division $1 a year lease. Some early 10th Mountain activities were headquartered there. Tom Flynn, aging, returned to his farm in California. The Aspen Ski Club, inspired and advised by Roche, had already opened some skiing on a run on Aspen Mountain, and they hosted major races, including the 1941 National Alpine Championships. Ryan recognized that though while he felt the Ashcroft site was superior, that momentum had shifted into Aspen itself. I'd like to think that there may not have been an Aspen without the early participation of the Highland Bavarian Corporation. Our partners and myself, our gift to the community was Andre Roche himself. Those elements gave the town a head start in defining its way into becoming one of the finest mountain resorts in the world. Now, next time you're in London, look long enough and you'll find the tablet erected in my memory in St. Paul's Cathedral. It's mounted on the back wall of the crypt between Nelson's tomb and the gift shop. It's a cold gray slab of granite fixed opposite a bust of the poet W.E. Henley and alongside a frieze of an astronomer named William Huggins. William Meade Lindsay Fiske III, an American citizen who died that England might live, August 18, 1940. Underneath, mounted in a gold frame on a green felt cushion, hangs a tattered pair of RAF pilot wings. Cheers.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Fiske?
Yes.
How did he meet Ted Ryan? How did you meet Ted?
Our families were connected. He's the grandson of Thomas Fortune Ryan. My father, William Fiske II, worked in the investment banking industry, and we ran in the same circles.
And you guys did not meet in California?
That's a bit of hyperbole that we like to promulgate, that we both met at the same party that we met Tom Flynn in California at that cocktail party.
It didn't happen.
No, not like that. Yes?
Well, so all through this, I've been trying to figure out what year you were born.
1911.
I
Oh, okay.
just got it now. I started with 1915, but I moved, then something you said, I moved it back to 1912, but now I got it.
Yeah, it was a pretty exciting time when you think about it to grow up in New York City and then eventually in Europe. And luckily we moved, we didn't spend too much time. Obviously I was too young, but my parents, moved out of the U.S. during the height of Prohibition and to Europe where, it could still be fun.
So how old were you when you were involved in the Highland Corporation?
Oh, in my mid-20s, 26, 25.
So 4 years before you.
Yeah, that cocktail party was in 1936. My birthday was June 4th, so right around my birthday, right around my 25th birthday. And then things happened very quickly. Basically, from the time we met Flynn to the construction of the Highland Bavarian Lodge was 6 months or less. Yes?
Did you do any competitive skiing?
Actually, you know what? I came to skiing sort of late. The bobsled was what I really enjoyed. Both the skeleton and then obviously later on the 4 and 5 man. I did ski. I enjoyed the uphill part of it, but it wasn't anything that my competitive energies were on the bobsled course. There's a wonderful picture of me and Andre Roche together on top of one of the peaks over here in the basin. Yes?
Did you meet Elizabeth Pepka when she came here to ski?
I wasn't here then. I did hear of her, but I was already in New York and then in Europe, in England by the time that happened.
Mike Monroney.
No, one more.
One last one. Did you guys ever think of doing Ajax?
What was the question?
The question is, did we ever think of developing Ajax?
Oh.
And I think what I was looking for, my vision, my experience, and partly it's because these communities are much farther north than Aspen, was of these big above timberline open spaces. And that's what I saw when I saw an alpine resort. Now, as we know, Aspen Mountain, you do get close to over 11,000 feet and above timberline, but it was those slopes, those open slopes in Little Annie Basin and the slopes on Mount Hayden, that's what caught my eye. To me, that spoke to me of what an alpine resort should be.
Thank you, Mike.
Any questions for me? Questions for me about Billy? Yeah.
I understand the plans for Mount Hayden and going over to Electric Pass and Cathedral. Who owns the restaurant up there?
The Mace family?
No.
You mean, oh, what?
John
Which
Wilcox.
restaurant? Oh, sorry, yes. John Wilcox.
Yeah, so evidently he has those plans. Do you know anything about that?
Just that they're very different from what we had originally conceived. We honestly were originally looking at the southwest facing slopes of Little Annie. Obviously, sun exposure isn't that great. It's where Powder Tours goes sometimes. And I didn't get into it. It's in my script, but it was too much detail. They were looking at Difficult too. They were exploring Difficult and the ridges on that side, but they also recognized that that's avalanche prone, as we know that it is today. So I guess in that sense, going back to the Ajax question, they were still looking at being based in Castle Creek, but with the possibility of bringing lifts all the way up to the ridge between Castle Creek and Aspen. Jordan.
Where'd you find all this information?
You know what? Honestly, the bulk of this was from British articles. And there's a wonderful book that a man named Andy Hull wrote that is not available in the US. It's called Speed Kings. And there were enough excerpts of this book online. All the bobsled stuff is from those books. And I actually found the official records of the 1932 Olympics. They're available online of everything that happened. And, there's been a play written about him. There was going to be a movie about him with Tom Cruise playing Billy Fiske. But the Brits, and probably quite rightly, responded with quite a bit of pushback because he officially didn't shoot any planes down. And you can imagine what a movie about Billy Fiske starring Tom Cruise would be like. He would be the central figure in the Battle of Britain, and that's just not what it was. But Cruz owns the story.
Interesting.
And there's a History Channel video about him that I haven't been able to find yet. Like a short
Probably just
History
as
Channel.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.